Hi guys, welcome again to my YouTube video. A few days back I promised to make a commentary on an incident that took place on a road somewhere in South Africa. I'm not sure really where, but it took place between a person who's driving a white Toyota Corolla and a certain law enforcement officer. We're not sure which department they belong to, so I will not endeavor to speculate. But what what was the message on Facebook was essentially people were applauding the guts that the driver had of the white Toyota Corolla. But first, allow me then to set the scene for you so that you can easily understand what are the issues that we are dealing with today and that I would be providing some input to. So it turns out that this particular driver was indeed following the traffic officer or the law enforcement officer, and this law enforcement officer crossed a red robot followed by a particular quantum, we can presume a taxi, and now somehow, I don't know what actually happened, the traffic officer saw this traffic violation and decided then to stop the owner of the white Toyota Corolla. And this is where now the altercation ensued, because now the traffic officer was exercising his powers in terms of the law to try and deal with a traffic infraction. Now, what ensues is a reluctance, one, by the driver of the motor vehicle to produce the said license, and then the exchange starts to happen. The driver reiterates to say that, well, I'm not going to give you my license. One, because you crossed the red robot yourself. Two, there was another taxi that crossed the robot with you. And he further goes on to articulate that even when you did cross the red robot, you didn't have your siren on, you didn't have your blue lights on, and as a result of that, the driver of the Toyota Corolla refuses then to cooperate with this law enforcement officer. Now, the law enforcement officer then suddenly responds and says, but between you and me, who is the law enforcement officer? You understand? Who is the man of the law, as he put it. And he essentially made an indication that he wants to give the said driver a ticket, and he implored him to get out of his car. And during the exchange and the refusal, he threatened to impound the vehicle of the member, and he essentially threatened to give him a ticket. And this was suddenly a very heated exchange. And and it's a very interesting exchange in the manner in which it happened. But there are serious issues that we must deal with in relation to this. I'm not really sure also as to how the whole incident eventually unfolded, because the video is quite short, so it didn't give me the pleasure to see the whole issue to the end. But I want to present to you three individuals that crossed the robot. There are three individuals that crossed the red robot in South Africa on a public road, one being the taxi operator driving a Quantum. We don't know who that is. Secondly is the driver of the Toyota Corolla, which is the person in question that the traffic officer wants to give a ticket to or impound his car. Then there is the traffic officer in this case. Now, the taxi, let's start with the taxi. The taxi crossed the red robot, and obviously in our country, this is indeed a violation, a traffic violation, and there should be consequences or repercussions that flow from such an incident. Depending on the circumstances, whether or not there was a necessity to do so, whether or not there was another traffic officer directing the traffic and then indicating that the taxi, for example, could could cross. But this is not such a case. This is a case of a red robot and a taxi deciding to cross over. Now there is the driver of the white Corolla who equally saw the taxi, saw the law enforcement officer crossing the red robot, and equally deciding that he will also cross the red robot. And this is a very interesting issue. So he crosses the red robot, and we know that this amounts to a violation, and he does not deny this. So we'll get into those issues later. But then there is the law enforcement officer who also, together with the taxi, crossed the red robot, and somehow the taxi driver is left to carry on with his business, while the poor driver of the white Toyota Corolla is apprehended. Now, this is a very interesting issue that I want to get into a little bit more between the exchange. But let's look at first the driver of the Corolla. What does he say? One, he was stopped by the law enforcement officer, which he complied with, and he stopped. He was requested his license, which instruction he refused to obey. He lamented the fact that the taxi driver was not stopped. He lamented the conduct of the law enforcement officer, who himself crossed a red robot without his siren, without blue lights being on or being in operation. And as a result, this is the basis of his refusal to cooperate with this law enforcement officer. Now, what does the law officer then say? The law officer, one, on the video, does not himself refuse that he crossed a red robot, and hides behind the fact that I am a law enforcement officer. So he says, but between you and me, who's the law enforcement officer? Does this status of a law enforcement officer give the law enforcement officer a right to cross a red robot? We will deal with this issue shortly. But it doesn't stop there. He threatens, one, to give the driver a ticket, threatens to impound his car, and then he promises really to make an example out of this driver. Now, what are the issues that I want to discuss with you? There's a number of issues, but the first one relates to the skipping of the red robot. Now, the red robot, there can be a number of scenarios that can play themselves out that might allow for one to cross a red robot. One is the red robot, which is then malfunctioning. And if the red robot is malfunctioning, maybe it is flickering all the time red, then it's used as a normal stop sign, and the person can then cross and do all the necessary drills to cross a normal stop sign. But there can be also maybe a traffic officer on the ground that's regulating the flow of traffic as a result of a dysfunctional robot, and that could provide perhaps authority for one to cross a robot that happens to be red. There's then another scenario, especially with ordinary members of the public, where there are issues of necessity, and then a person can, being in a rush because of some whatever situation of necessity, cross a red robot. But that's another issue, and it's not what the facts in this case indicate. So the driver really clearly does not have a justification of this, why he crossed the red robot. Now, so that is a clear traffic violation, and in my view, the traffic officer would be well within his rights to call this person and do all the necessary or follow all the necessary procedures to ensure that this member of the public accounts for his violations or conduct. Now, there is this element now that I want to get into, and this is where it gets very interesting. And perhaps this is where you will see that Perhaps the driver of the Corolla was not so stupid after all, but it's where it comes to the law enforcement officer. Now, obviously, there are a number of scenarios also wherein the law enforcement officer can cross a red robot. These are all the scenarios that I've already alluded to, but there is another scenario. This is a scenario where the traffic officer, in the execution of his functions, in the performance of his functions or duty, engaged in civil protection, so he's literally working. And when he's working, he is allowed to cross a red robot. But this is not a blanket, allowed. It has conditions to it. So you can cross a red robot as a law enforcement officer, provided, one, that you have due regard to the safety of others when you are crossing the robot. But then there is an interesting one. Provided that the vehicle is fitted with certain what we would call, for example, what we are used to as sirens, for example, or blue lights, and provided that that siren and those blue lights are operational. So if those sirens and those blue lights are not operational, then the traffic officer does not have the authority to cross the red robot. And if he does, in the absence of necessity, then and other things that I've already alluded to, would then himself be in violation of the traffic rules and regulations. So what is clear in my view is that the law applies to everybody equally, and it provides even to law enforcement officers circumstances under which they might be exempt from complying with certain legal requirements, and these are clearly stipulated in the National Road Traffic Act. This is a document that all of us can go look at and inform ourselves as to what is actually expected of all of us on the road. Secondly, the concern that I have is the unequal treatment between the taxi driver and the driver of the Corolla. Why is it that the one is stopped? Why is it that the other is left? Is it an issue maybe of power relations between, normal citizen and a taxi driver? I'm not sure. But the point is, there was unequal treatment by law enforcement of individuals that equally violated the law. And this definitely, in the eyes of the public, cannot be accepted. It cannot be acceptable. Again, I want to discuss a little bit about the refusal to cooperate with the law enforcement officer. Whether or not the law enforcement officer crossed a red robot with you or not is neither here nor there. There are processes and procedures that one can follow to ensure that that particular traffic officer accounts in such an instance. But it does not give anybody a right to undermine the authority of the state, to undermine the work of law enforcement in our country. It definitely does not, because there is a legal requirement for all of us to cooperate with law enforcement officials, to produce our identity documents or our licenses, to say when we are involved in such a situation. So when you refuse to, or when you obstruct the law enforcement officer in the execution of his functions, this is equally very problematic, and it's something that I will not discourage. So the courage that the driver of the Corolla had is good but misguided. Misguided in a sense that the fact that the law enforcement officer violated the law like he did does not therefore give him the power to undermine the law of our country. And equally, the fact that the driver of the Corolla violated the law does not give the law enforcement officer the power to abuse his position as a law enforcement official and to himself disregard the the authority of the state, the laws of this country, especially because he is an example. He must serve as an example to the people of our country. Remember, law enforcement officials have a higher duty, in my view, as custodians of the law, to respect the law and to teach society how they should go about respecting the law, especially the rules of the road. There is another element that is very problematic, and that is the attitude of both members. And I believe that there was a more mature way in which both of them could have addressed the issue. The only problem is that when you yourself have dirty hands, it becomes very difficult to have a moral high ground, or to expect that people will respect you when you're enforcing the law. It's like a person that violates the law or the traffic regulations, but wants to enforce them simultaneously for having done the same thing. It does not make sense to me. There is also an issue that we must address here, the public expectation. What do we expect from our law enforcement officials? We expect them to respect the law like all other citizens, especially when they are on a frolic of their own and they are not busy with the execution of their functions. And even if they are in the execution of their functions, there are clear guidelines as to what must happen when they are busy with that. And I don't think any South African in their right minds would mind a law enforcement officer crossing a red robot when all the necessary requirements are met. And this is something that I want to highlight, to say it's important for law enforcement officers to behave in a disciplined manner and to ensure that when they are executing their functions, they respect the rules of the road, they respect other road users, they respect the law, because this is expected of them. And it is very worrisome that he would act as if law enforcement officers are above the law, that they somehow have a higher status that gives them impunity. And this is one of the biggest concerns lately in our law, where individuals deem themselves to be above the law, especially when they are faced with accounting. You understand? And it's something that I discourage. If you are a law enforcement officer, it is, in my view, more important for you to respect the law, and this is what I would have expected. I have already provided a clear guideline to say the law applies to all of us, whether you are a civilian, whether you are a law enforcement officer, or whether you are a VIP in this country. The rules of the road apply to every one of us the minute they are promulgated and signed by the president. Now, what should happen in this instance? In my view, the driver of the white Corolla unfortunately transgressed traffic regulations and must get his due in accordance with the law. And that process cannot be undermined on the basis of the conduct of the law enforcement officer in this instance. However, the same principle applies to the law enforcement officer, where he himself violated the law. The same consequences should follow. Driving in a state vehicle does not exempt you from following the rules of the road, from respecting the road signs or respecting the speed on our roads. There is a reason why those rules or laws are there in the first place, and that is to ensure that our roads are safe and sound for all of us. So that is what I, in short, encourage, that the driver must get a ticket, the law enforcement officer must get his ticket, and importantly, we must learn to respect each other, especially when the public must respect the law enforcement officers. The law enforcement officers must respect the public. In that way, all of us would be behaving appropriately. So having said that, ladies and gentlemen, next time when you are stopped by the law enforcement officers on our roads, then I believe that you would be better empowered to deal with them and to address them. I am looking forward to loading another video shortly, and I hope you really were engaged. Thank you very much.